Hey there, Transformers. Welcome to Work Transformed, the podcast that tackles the ever-evolving world of product development, project chaos, and everything in between. Each episode, we'll dive into the hottest trends, unpack the latest tools, and chat with inspiring guests who are leading the charge. So, buckle up, get ready to transform your work, and let's do this.
Hello, Transformers, and welcome to a new episode of Work Transformed with my lovely and forever co-host, Thomas Lenore. I am Jackie Bittner, and we have got an amazing topic today that I hope we go a little sideways on because there's so many different ways to talk about this, but I would love to dive into a conversation on metrics and measures. How do we use them? What do we use them for? How do we feel about them? Does saying the word metric already give you anxiety?
Are you at home cringing right now?
You at home going, oh no, not another thing to measure. But yeah, I think I'd love to dive into this topic. We kind of teed it up in a previous podcast as a useful way to do some sort of communicating. But metrics and measures, what are we doing with them? What are we ignoring them for? I feel like in the SWOT analysis kind of discussion, the W, what do I avoid? A weakness is, what is the measure? What is the metric? Has been historically the past, Jackie.
Can we talk about what you said this morning? Because I think that's like a very good starting point.
Yeah, let's do it. What did I say this morning?
Oh, wow. That's not good. It's only 1 o'clock. So if you don't remember, that's problematic. No, this morning I was like, what if we talk about metrics on the podcast? And you're like, and I was like, we don't have to. And you're like, yeah, no, I want to. It's just like, I got anxious. I got very nervous all of a sudden. And I was like, yeah. And I found that is normally the response. People have one of two gut reactions when someone says metrics. They say, oh my God, and they feel either inadequate, like they don't know basic math and can't talk about metrics, like they just don't feel like they don't know what they are. Or the second reaction I get a lot is like the people who are on a power trip and they're like, yeah, let's talk about metrics. Let's look at these things. And why is this so bad? And why is this not going in the right direction? And like the people who are like using them to bash you and shame you. And so it's either people are scared of metrics or they love them for all the wrong reasons. You meet very few people who are just like, yeah, metrics they're good and they're useful and they're just okay. Like that's not a reaction you get. You either get people who are crippled by fear or are on this weird power trip.
I think you might have just solved why is my reaction always like, yes, but wait, I need to be prepared. I think I've been a victim of someone bashing metrics without understanding what the story is behind them or how to use them. And so I actually love talking about metrics, but I used to not. But I do love them now. And I think to Thomas's point, there are these schools of thought where you say, I want to talk about metrics, and someone's super jazzed. They're like, yeah, let's dive in. What is this data? What is this telling us? What is this thing? Or you've got the opposite effect where it's like, I'm going to avoid this and run away. I'm afraid. I'm anxious. Can I talk about this?
Maybe we start with that whole idea, because you said you love it. So maybe we start with why do you love it? What are metrics? Why are they even a thing? Because I think for so many people, metrics exist and have existed maybe before they came into that role or that job or whatever. And so they get it, but they don't maybe understand why. And I'll only get a personal example. I've worked with teams before where we had team level metrics. And they were slightly different from productivity metrics. It wasn't like how many widgets did you get through the system in an hour. There were things to help us understand how there's the quality, how sustainable is our pace, things like that. And it wasn't until I explained it, it's only with this information I'm able to help make things better that they got it. Because I'm pretty sure they thought I was just collecting these just for the heck of it, because that's what my job was, to collect meaningless metrics. So what are metrics? Why do we have them, Jackie?
Oh man, I'm going to write down, we don't want meaningless metrics. So I'll tell you a story. You asked me, why do I love them? And it came from a very specific experience. So in part of our roles in our past life, and I'm sure some of you now listening, are concerned
with... Is this a story from Ace Hardware?
One time at Ace Hardware, I was doing my metrics. No, I didn't have metrics there.
They probably have them and you just didn't know.
Right? Well, so we had always, in many previous lives of mine, collected like a velocity metric, right, for teams. And there was always this like negative connotation around what velocity means. And to define velocity really quickly for some of our audience who may not know, it's the amount of work you could get done in a given set of time, right? This is how fast you're running. You get X amount of things done in this amount of time, right? And so, uh, at one company, we had a task to capture our velocity metrics, and we averaged them out over the past 5 sprints. We had 2-week sprints at the time, and we would do a little bit of calculating to show off like how close you were to your average, or what your average was, where you should be hitting your velocity given 5 sprints and all of that. And we had a color coding system where if you were off by so much within this percentage, you would be coded as either amber or red, or if you were within, it was green. And this forum at first was quite terrifying, because the conversation wasn't geared around, why is it like this? It was, why is this like this? Fix this to make it better. This team shouldn't be operating at this percentage, right? With no real like valuable conversation being driven. It was more like a shame fest, and like people that weren't even involved in the conversation would hear about it through the grapevine and just felt like these metrics were metrics for the sake of being judged. And that was bad. And that is why people don't like metrics. And that is why people shy away from velocity. But then we had this moment, a revolutionary moment, if you will, where we were able to take a pause, highlight this current state of shaming and how it's impacting our teams to just game the system, right? Like, it's not actually helping people get things done. It's helping people put story points on things and then call it done so that they don't get talked to, like they don't have to talk about why they were under or over or whatever, what have you. And so we transformed the way we spoke of the metrics. We didn't speak about red as being bad or amber as being not good enough. We started talking about like, wow, there were these big swings. I wonder what caused it. And like calling out, what's the root cause? Oh, we had a huge release and several defects went with it. Ooh, that's not a great thing. What can we learn? And we started talking about the opportunity. Is there opportunity here to learn something? Is there opportunity here to share information with other teams about what we've experienced? And that seemingly shameful, judgmental metrics review pivoted and turned into a great, fruitful conversation about opportunity and improvement. And that, I think, is when it turned around for me too. That's when I started to really enjoy, using metrics to drive conversations instead of using metrics to shut teams down.
I think it's interesting because even in your story, it's about making it real for folks. Like that's when I find that metrics are most effective and impactful, when you can make it real to the people who are being measured. Because just imagine, like, if there was a person who just sat at your desk all day and like wrote things down about you, and metrics aren't quite the same as like observations, but like in terms of how you feel and how you perceive it, it's the same thing as if someone just sit there all day and observed you, and that would feel awful. And you don't know what they're doing with this information. They just tell you that they need to collect it, and they will use it for something, and then great, it vanishes forever. Like at some point, you'd be like, "Oh my god, what is this person doing?" And your behavior, either positively or negatively, it's impossible. No, we'll eventually be impacted. It's only when you make it real and you're like, hey, I noticed how many buttons you have to click in order to get to the next screen, and it's a little excessive. And so I wrote that down so that I can take it to your boss and be like, hey, we need to fix this system or this process. Then you're like, oh, well, if that's what you're going to use this information for, let me show you all these other things. Like when you can get people to understand, they are a lot more open. And I think the same is true about metrics. When you use the metrics to then start conversations around like, hey, folks, we used to be able to get seven tickets done in a sprint. now we're only able to get 4. Like, what has changed? And you might learn that the work has changed. Like, it's more complex. Some of the tools or subscriptions they had access to, they don't have access to anymore. Some of the people on the team have left, and so that institutional knowledge is gone. Like, there are all these root causes that you need to
Mhm.
start the conversation some kind of way, and you don't want to start it subjectively, being just by saying it seems like we're moving slower than we used to. Like, that feels like you are judging the team versus you coming with the
Blame.
metrics and the
Right.
data. Yeah, it's a blame game versus you coming back with the metrics and the data and say, hey, folks, I've observed this using this, you know, publicly available information that we collect. Let's talk about it. And it's just a different conversation.
But honestly, I think to your point, like there's two things that I really piece out of there. And in the make it real means make it transparent. Why are you collecting these things? When you're collecting some sort of information on someone and they don't know why, defense walls go up. Similarly, when you're talking about those things, those metrics, to your point, Thomas, if you say, it seems like y'all slowed down this past sprint, like immediate defense goes up. Like, we didn't slow down. 3 people are on vacation. Like, that's not a great way to kick off that conversation. But if you say something like, oh, I noticed in the metrics we got 7 done last time and 4 this time. Do we know why? Do we know why that is? And we feel comfortable about it? Oh yeah, 3 people are on vacation. Oh wow, that makes total sense. Oh, you still got 4 done with 3 people out? Swell, good job. Like whatever that is. And so I think that's the thing about the metrics conversation holistically is like making it real and transparent, understanding why we're using them. And if you like, it's almost, I almost have this mindset like, if you don't know why certain metrics are captured or being reported on, say something, right? If you see something, say something. And that's what we did in my example of velocity metrics. It wasn't right what it was being used for. It was creating a negative environment, a very fear-based environment. And so in my role, I was like, I don't like this. This isn't helpful to me. These are some of the cascading effects that it's having, and they're not positive ones. I'd like to do this. Like, I'd like to talk about it this way. And we experimented with it, and it was really great. Um, we talked a lot about, well, we didn't talk a lot yet. It's only been 11 minutes, maybe 12. But we're sticking with for now productivity metrics or some of those like measurable things that you use to track like forecasting and what have you. Are there any metrics, Thomas, that you have have used that have been like well accepted for the with your teams, or maybe conversely not as accepted?
I can start with the conversely part for sure. Uh, indivi- Individual level metrics tend not to be very well accepted. And I know that's very controversial because a lot of people who are, I'm going to use the term managers intentionally. A lot of people who are managers want that for assessment purposes. They want to be able to say, "Oh, you only, create one widget per day, but most people create 3. You're going too slow." And I think that's probably why people don't typically like them that much because it like points out how you may be slower or more inefficient or etc. And
Hmm.
I do think there is a place at times for individual metrics, but one of the rules I have around that is typically if we're going to have any individual level metrics, they're not going to be publicly available. Like we share team level metrics. We don't share individual human level metrics publicly because it does lead to judgment and other issues. If it's a performance related thing that you're trying to track, as a manager, that's something you talk about one on one. And even still, when you're using those metrics for performance related activities, you need to talk about what does that you need to talk about the why behind the metric. So yeah, you only create one widget, most people create 3. Like, are you having challenges? Where are the barriers for you? And then you need to use those to create action plans, not just to shame the person. So that's one thing that has not been really well receptive. Metrics that are individual level. The other one is metrics that don't have a therefore. Like we for a long time collected like a list like 20 metrics. And I remember one time the team was like, "What do we use this for?" And I was like, "Oh, well, this one we use for this, and this one we use for that." And there were like 4 of them, and I was like, "And we it's helpful to have this information." And they were like, "Why, Thomas? Why is it helpful to have this?" And I was like, "Oh, I don't know right now. Maybe later I'll know." And they were like, "You won't know." And like we stopped collecting them because they were just like meaningless. So I know that those aren't specific metrics, but like those are categories of metrics that have not gone over well.
Well,
Go
I
ahead.
think it's important, especially when you go back to these individual level metrics. So, in my story, it was a team level metric that was being shared, right? We weren't calling out individuals on a team. We were talking about a development team that was executing against their backlog. And they estimated their backlog based on the best of their abilities at the time. And that's like another thing that can happen is you could estimate wrong, and that's okay because it's called estimation. It's not called actuals. Actuals a different thing. But the cool thing about getting your estimates so wildly off means there is a learning opportunity. Like, ooh, we thought this was going to be about like this size, a medium, but then when we dug in, holy cow, this thing was an extra, extra, extra large. What in the world did we forget to think about when we were doing estimation, right? Like, totally can ask those questions. And if your environment is open and you know why you're using your metrics, then that conversation becomes an easy one to have. But a lot of times, teams, if they feel like they're being judged by it, I mean, I've experienced this. I don't know if you've experienced this, but I'm sure you have also, where the question is, well, why aren't the teams better at estimating? And it's like, well, can we talk about the learning opportunity? I know AI is like up and coming up quick, but I'm still not a robot. As far as I know, all the humans that I work with that do the estimates also not robots as far as they know. And like, you could put great practices in play where you do like relative sizing. Hey, this ticket is about the same as this one. These are very similar work streams. They're very similar in complexity. But like every now and then a mistake is going to be made. And mistakes, honestly, should be like celebrated as learning opportunities versus the
Can we
shame on
table this,
you.
or put this in the parking
Yeah.
lot? Not because it's not important. I think it's super important, but I think it's gonna take us off track because I have a whole rant about how people outside of the team perceive metrics and the dangers there in general. And I want to get to that because that's juicy. But I also want to share some of the metrics that I've used that have worked well and been received well while we're on that train of thought. If that's okay. You tell me. You're the
Okay.
host this week.
Oh, sure. Well, let me just make sure I got your parking lot correct. You want a parking lot for the moment, how people outside of the team perceive metrics. Is this an accurate
That is correct. That is a true
representation
and
of your
factual
request?
statement.
I like that. I have written it down. It is acceptable to put in the parking lot, and I may pull it back in later.
Okay. Well, I do.
Okay.
I want to pull it back in. Don't leave the car parked out there on the curb all day like it's a Miata. It's a Porsche. You got to bring that in the lot. Anyhow,
Drive it
um,
on back.
one of the metrics that I've used is super unconventional that has worked really well is this idea of a team happiness score. So on a set cadence, like every 2 weeks, we'll do a fist of five check-in. And for those who are unfamiliar with the fist of five, everyone's on camera. Although there are ways that obviously you can also do this off camera, but everyone's on camera and they just like using their one hand. So you have up to five fingers. If you want to put up 0 fingers, it's a fist. So it's fist to five. Um, how are you feeling? And we don't put any qualifiers on it because maybe they have outside of work emotional things that are like taking a toll on them, and not like that's important because if you're going through a rocky divorce, I'm I mean, I can expect, but I, as a human, don't expect you to be your best self at work. Like there are other factors at play here that are causing emotional drain. It's like I just ask how folks are doing. I will say 85 to 90% of the gripes that you do here are work based. So it's like you don't get a lot of noise from like people's personal life, but every now and then you will. But for the most part, people are like, oh, I'm frustrated about these things. But when you ask people how they feel, I've noticed that they don't always tell you candidly, especially if you're in a position of power where you're like a superior to them. They're gonna say, "Oh, things are fine. They're okay. Thanks for checking in." But when you tell them, I'm not gonna ask you to tell me why you feel this way. Just tell me from a fifth to five how you're feeling right now. They will be a lot more candid. You're gonna get a lot more twos and threes than you get if you just ask them verbally. Everyone's gonna be a 4 or 5 if you ask them, "Oh, things are going well.
Is
Thanks so much."
five is five the happiest?
Yeah,
And
5 is
0
stellar.
is
Like,
the
I am amazing, and 0 is like, I am horrible. Like, I already wrote my letter of resignation. It just hasn't sent out to you yet.
oh gosh. And really the goal is not to like dive into what's making them feel where they are at the scale. Is it more
No, no, no,
driving
no.
awareness for and that's what the cameras are on for the awareness
Yeah.
factor?
It does a lot of things actually, because I keep it. So it's a longitudinal study as well. And so first in the moment, it helps us
Oh.
to understand like our velocity was low this week or this cadence, and everyone's like at a two. So we may need to have a team building event. Like we may need to go out for a happy hour or like do something to help refill people. Or if there's a pressing concern, hopefully that'll come out in the retro, because I do this at the start of the retro so that like that is kind of the like precursor to, okay, now let's talk about feelings. And again, you don't have to tell me explicitly why you put up only 2 fingers, but I'm hoping that if there are concerns, you will now share them. It's like it helps to
Related,
kind of pull
yeah.
back the curtain for the retro. And then the last thing is I looked at them over time, and I can overlay like big company events. Like we did a reorg, and for the next 3 check-ins, everyone was like low, and so like that. I can only assume because correlation doesn't causation doesn't equal correlation, so I can't say it definitely was because of this, but like it's just coincidental that we did this reorg, and now everyone went from like an average of 4 to an average of 2. Like there's probably some feelings there that we need to address, but it actually did a lot of things, which is why I love it.
That's interesting.
Let
And
me
that
think. Is
also
there
kind
any
of
other?
like
I mean,
helps. Oh, internets. And it also like helps with like we've done like those post surveys also, which I think are really insightful and really
mhm.
helpful. And I would be curious uh if I had like the details of the Fist of Five check because I also do things of that nature in my team meetings, and it's not always a Fist of Five, but sometimes it'll be, tell me what your temperature is today. Tell me what you're feeling in terms of the weather. I like to get all abstract about it. Some people appreciate it, others do not. But that is such an interesting thing, though, Thomas, to keep like almost a record of that to see how it does correlate and match up. Because then you can start to almost proactively know, like a big company event is coming up. I expect my team's, you know, Fist of Five happiness scale is going to either tip up because of based on whatever event or tip down based on whatever the event is. And that gives you kind of already like proactive, actionable steps on how to work with them on things. So cool. Look at all this proactive predictability stuff happening.
I try. I try. I'm trying to think of the other ones that I've used in the past. I also use different things at the organization level because, like, a lot of these are just team level, but I've also done like organizational change management where I've worked across, departments and sectors. And something that's not exactly a metric, but I do encourage. Um, I don't know what other topic this would fall into. I guess it could fall into just general change management strategies. But anyway, one of the things that I recommend is also having this option to do like anonymous feedback. It
Mm-hmm.
almost turns itself into a metric though, because sometimes you'll get these like themes that people like everyone will have anonymous feedback on. And then you can kind of look at it and say, like, oh, of the 40 respondents, 23 of them said that like pay disparities were concerning to them. And like, so that's probably a
Yeah.
big deal. And we used to use a Google platform, and we set up so that it was like anonymous to us, but each person could only submit once, and that way we could be sure that like the same person wasn't submitting their grievance 5 times to inflate the numbers. And
Understood.
so it's not a metric per se, but like it's a great opportunity to get to the sentiment of like how people feel and what things are concerning, because there were some things that ended up becoming metrics. Like one of the things that people talked about at one point was diversity within our organization. And so we create metrics around like interviewing benchmarks, hiring and recruiting benchmarks. And so it's like, hey, our goal is to be more diverse. Everyone's frustrated about this. So now we want to make sure for every role we at least interview 10% or have an interview roster that's at least 10% diverse. So if we interview 100 people, at least 10 of those people were meeting some diversity criteria. And so like that wasn't a metric, but it yielded a metric.
Well, it was a measure. It was like you measuring what the current state, and then that funneled into an actionable plan that had a metric associated with it. And that kind of reminds me, pivoting a little bit from these productivity metrics and team metrics almost into like product metrics, like the success criteria. So in this example, diversity is very important to the population. They felt like it was not being at the forefront of the hiring needs, and that converted into having a 10% metric as part of the recruitment process. We needed to have candidates that met some sort of diversity criteria. And to me, that sounds like a lot of like success criteria. Like, I want to launch this new thing. This piece is important. And then here is a actual number or percentage number as part of the success criteria. One of the things we talked about in the last podcast about mid-year planning was kind of around how do you communicate some of these important pieces of work to folks that may not see their importance. And like part of it is going back to that success criteria. Like, does this make sense, and is it valuable, and what is that success criteria? And one of those things that we kind of showcased was, if it's to hit a revenue target, like what percentage of that revenue target does this feature need to hit in order for us to be on the correct track to stay profitable as a company, right? It drives these conversations. And oftentimes, I don't know, maybe not oftentimes, but in my experience, sometimes like it like immediately gets overlooked when it really should be the first thing that we go ask about.
Absolutely. I mean, I think so. In a lot of cases, I would imagine fear also drives some of that. Like we don't want to. I've been in situations where you don't even want to ask about metrics or measures because you don't want to be held accountable for the outcome when you don't feel like you have control. It's one
Yeah.
thing to know that this is a goal. It's another thing to feel like you are empowered and have the support to influence the goal. Someone can tell me we're going to sell 1,000,000 units this year, and I could be the sales leader. If that's what you told me we're going to do, it doesn't seem like I have the ability to veto it. So sure, okay, great.
Yeah.
I may not feel like I can do it though. And so it's one thing to say, yes, this is my goal. And I might not ask for any clarification or follow because the more clarification and follow up I ask for, the more I'm going to learn that I have to do that I don't feel confident in. And
Oh
so I
no.
think that may be one reason why people don't talk about the measures as much as just the goal itself.
I just had this thought though. There's like something to be said about, okay, if you ever experienced, this is like a show of, have you ever done this? Has this ever happened to you? But like, okay, scope creep. That's a thing that happens on
Oh,
products, on
absolutely.
features, on roadmaps. And so what is like one way to feel empowered to push back against scope creep? Well, man, grab that success criteria and say, that's not part of the original success criteria. Is it more important than these things, right? And then like use that as your talking point. And I feel like it's such a power that anyone could flex on the team when scope, like we all see it happening. We will, oh, just slip this in, just slip this in. If we just took a pause and said, hey, I looked at my success criteria, and having the ability to go through this workflow automatic was not part of it. It was part of this beginning. It was not part of this. Like, do we care that much about this? Because that's a huge amount of scope, and that means this thing will be delayed by XYZ time. And it's such a simple thing as hopefully your success criteria is housed somewhere easily accessible and visible to you, whether it's in a tool or it's on a Word doc or it's on something. But I just had this aha moment of, why aren't we using this as an empowerment tool? And that's really what the metric should be anyway, in general, as a tool to
Yeah.
empower teams and people to look at things and make good decisions and good choices and improve.
So it's interesting you say look at things in terms of success criteria because at the last place I worked, or at the time he was our SVP of technology, he rolled out these DORA metrics. And for folks who are not familiar with them, they are these metrics that um, came from the DevOps side of engineering and really are meant to assess how uh, advanced and or mature a tech company is against a certain set of criteria, and if it's also a way to aspire to be better. So like here are concrete metrics as well as the thresholds or gates within those metrics that are I don't remember what the terminology is, so I'm just gonna say poor, good, and great. And he rolled this out, but connecting it to your idea, for each, and maybe it wasn't for each one, maybe it was like for a cluster of the metrics, he'll say, and this is important because blank. So it wasn't as much like a success criteria, but it was like a so what. Because it's like, how long does it take from commit to deploy? Well, I know that the goal is less than 1 hour, but like, why does that matter? And so he's like, and therefore, as we have critical defects, issues, or even outages, we're able to quickly roll back and get, I mean, not roll back, but quickly get things into production and have minimal manual intervention. And therefore, like an outage is much like smaller. And like, that makes
Yeah.
sense. That's like, oh, yeah. That, I could see why we want to do that. That makes sense to me. But if you tell a developer we just want to minimize the time, great. There's a 50 million other things we can also focus on. Like, why did we choose this one out of thin air? And so I love this
Yeah.
idea of success criteria or objectives or outcomes or something that makes it more tangible for the person other than just saying like, oh, our goal is A. And that's gonna be like, okay. Are they
Or
committed? Are they
like
bought in? Are they feeling empowered? Probably not.
or like just saying that we want to decrease the amount of time. Like that's too ambiguous to be a metric, right? Like it's too like, okay, I decreased
Absolutely.
it by 0.2 seconds, done. You know what I mean? Like some of these things really have to have a lot of thought put into it, like what can be achievable, what should be the measure, right? If like I want to reduce, the deployment cycle from 5 minutes to 4 minutes, like that's probably a terrible example, but I want to decrease that deployment time by that amount of time. But it has like a numeric value, and like that numeric value is the thing that you're shooting for. And if you don't hit it, then you could talk about it. And if you don't hit it, but things are going better, like you could talk about it. It's just like those very like wishy-washy metrics of I just want to be online for a little while today. Well, what's a little while? What does that mean? Like an
Mhm.
hour for this podcast or 20 minutes or 3 seconds? Like, I don't know.
Well,
So
they should be
anyway,
online for at least the entire duration of this podcast. We're gonna miss some real great stuff. But
hopefully.
yeah, your metrics have to be meaningful. They have to be quantifiable, and quantifiable in a way that doesn't require rocket science. I've had some metrics where it's like we had to put the data into an Excel spreadsheet, and like the metric itself was calculated from the spreadsheet, and so people didn't even know how to influence it because there were so many like factors that
Mhm.
went into the calculation that probably wasn't the simplest metric because I as an individual contributor don't know what I can do singularly to make it any better because it's like,
Yeah,
oh, total process time divided by number of steps in the process times number of people working that week divided by company holiday. It's like, I don't know what this is. And so you also have to make sure the metric makes sense to the people. I get that you might be trying to do some
that's
things
true.
behind the scenes, but like at the end of the day, if it doesn't make sense, people can't inspect and adapt and figure out, oh, if I make these changes to the way I work, or if I make these changes to the tool, it'll be better because they don't get how the metric is calculated.
Yeah, calculating the metrics is such an interesting thing. So one thing that I was working on previously was trying to figure out what the calculation looks like for an ROI metric for project work, which is super interesting, right? Because there's obviously a cost to do development, cost to have the employees work on whatever they're working on, cost in tools, cost in licensing, and all of that. And when you have these like larger things that are going to market that are going to take a year or 2 years or 3 years to really see that kind of revenue uptick, I've always been curious on a really good way to figure out how to start calculating that ROI. Because most times, at least in my world, once something is released and done, it's out there, it's being sold, like we never really go back and like check on it and say, how much is it being sold? Are we even hitting our revenue targets? And things of that nature. And so those are things that I keep line of sight now, is to say, was that super valuable? And or if it was, excellent. What's the bright spot there? What can we use for future developments and future projects? Or if it wasn't, like let's say we're under on the ROI, they're like, oh, well, where do we miss a beat? Did we do too much of a big bang for this without learning the impacts to the market? Should we just work in smaller iterations or smaller features out there? What do our clients need? Like that's something that I have not
Well,
yet
those are great.
mastered how
Those are
to
great metrics.
calculate, and am always curious about it.
We we so often think about productivity metrics, like how do we measure the effectiveness of our human capital, which is super important,
Mm-hmm.
but we don't often have
Mm-hmm.
metrics in place about how do we measure the output of what they've done. And so things like feature adoption is a good one. Like, okay, we have the, I'm gonna make a overly simplistic product here. We are a virtual whiteboard company, and every 6 weeks we come out with a new feature. We gotta, import GIF button. We got a, shapes button. We got animations. We got all these things. How many times do those things get clicked on? At what point do we want to retire these features? Because metric number two, what is the cost of maintenance? Because yes, we roll
Mm.
something out, and maybe people are buying a lot of it, but it might also be very costly for us to maintain it. Which means one of two things. To me, it could mean, hey, we need to focus more on how do we streamline this? How do we do more automation and remove humans from the process? Because typically humans are the most costly piece. Or B, are we rolling out so many features that only a 20% of them account for 80% of the actual product usage, and then can we sunset and retire some of this stuff? Like
I
those are
was just gonna
conversations you only
say
have when you have the metrics
sunsetting.
and the data.
Yeah, I was gonna say that, or do you stop doing something? I think you had a really great story in a previous podcast where that's exactly what the data was saying is like, why are we doing this? It doesn't make good business sense. We're gonna sunset this item because it doesn't make good business sense. Um,
I've lived that life several times when things just didn't make good business sense, and I regret to tell you that not every time did everyone else come to that same conclusion. Some people are like, "Well, we just need to market it more," and I'm like, "No, let's cut
well,
our losses while we're behind."
that's all. That's also true. And then there's also metrics that are like not as easily quantifiable. Like if you build this thing, maybe it's not going to increase revenue, but your employee satisfaction will tick up really, really high. Like that's why all of the conversations around metrics is it's not just one metric and it's cut and dry and the story is done. Your metrics and your measures should tell you a story, and you should be able to follow along that story and understand that story, that holistic story, to then make decisions on what you're going to do next, whether it's an improvement or a new feature or sunsetting something. It's interesting because it's not once and done, not a once and done type of thing.
Well, I think that's a great segue into the parking lot item, bringing a Porsche into the lot. How do these metrics get discussed and understood and made real to people who are not involved day to day in them? Because great example when we go back to these team level metrics around like development, it's easy for me, Mr. COO, or me, Mr. Vice President of Technology, or me, Mr. Insert title of person who hasn't been hands on keyboard in a long time, to say, wow, when I look across all of the teams in my department, these two things or these four teams seem like they're really doing poorly, and these five teams are doing stellar. Like, how can we make these teams better? And that's
Mm-hmm.
such a dangerous game. It becomes so dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
Every time I give metrics, I always say these metrics are not for the sake of comparison. Because especially for anyone who's done Scrum or any kind of agile framework, you know that if you're using story points, that's a totally fictitious unit of measure anyway. It's like you have made up the numbers already, and the real value comes in the consistency and the patterns that you see over time, not the actual numerical values.
Not the
And so,
actual numbers. Can we say it
yes,
again? Can we just say it again? Because one,
yeah,
you cannot compare teams' story points to other teams' stories points. They don't matter. They don't mean anything. A 23 total velocity does not mean that it's better than the 10 velocity. It just means the team is
mhm,
using the Fibonacci sequence in a way that
different.
works the best for them.
Yep.
Wow. All right, done. Continue on, sir.
But that's important. Like that's where I'm going with this. Like sometimes things like you're showing this data, you put this PowerPoint together, you're so jazzed, and to you because you live, sleep, and breathe this information, it's clear what the like what this data is leading you to conclude. And you present it, and all the people are saying is like, "Wow, this is great." Now I see that we really can let this team go because they're barely doing anything. You're like, "No, that's not what I'm saying at all." And like,
I
and I have had
yeah.
teams. Go ahead, Jackie.
I'm so sorry. I just had two things pop into my head. I mean, the first one, and we'll get back to it, is there are things that we do as like the owners or the capturers of this information to maybe anonymize it, change it to percentages, right? So that it's not like looking at like 23 versus
Yep.
10. But I just had this memory, and I hope if this person's listening, don't kill me for sharing this story. But there was an intern that we were working with, and amazing human. I love this person so much. And they had to do a big presentation, and they chose velocity to do their presentation on, like, how do you help teams and all of this. And they for some reason were stuck on the idea of how they could use that velocity to say like the team is doing bad or the team is doing whatever. And I was at the time and still very passionate about like, ooh, this is a bad choice. Like you're gonna open yourself up to get questions that you cannot answer from a panel because what you're sharing is off base, right? They're gonna dig into this. They're gonna dig into this piece about using this to judge like how good the team is. And that person did not heed the warning and went and it was so funny because there was another coworker with us at the time. Our friend, our intern came back and just said, yeah, they dug into here. And there our other coworker was like, Jackie told you million times, and it's just funny because metrics can be intimidating like that. If you think you know what they mean and you're going to use it for this purpose, since you've already got it worked out in your head that this is what this means, like that is such a hard thing to get out of. And bringing it all back to people outside of the teams. People outside of the teams already have it in their head what this thing means. And it takes a real big change champion or a champion of these metrics or someone to really take that step back and say, wait a minute, I think you think this means this, and I'm going to talk you through what it actually is, because this is not quite accurate.
And you have to be willing to put yourself up at personal brand risk. And I say that half joking, but half serious, because I have been accused in multiple different settings, not just once, but like multiple times in my career of like guarding or protecting or hiding the information. And I every time said the same thing. I say, I am not hiding anything from you all. I said, but my goal is to give you information that you can use safely and correctly. And if I don't have the confidence that you can do that, I'm not going to share information that could be potentially detrimental to the team if misused. And so, like, but that comes at personal risk to my reputation, because it says Thomas is trying to hide some important information he doesn't want us to know, or he's trying to protect the teams that are underperforming. And it's like, no, I'm not trying to do that, because trust me, my job as a transformation leader is to make the business better. So I would be doing myself a disservice by trying to keep it poor. But at the same time, because I have a real life example, I had a team that was consistently carrying stories forward, like every single sprint, carrying stories forward, consistently underachieving whatever they committed to. So they might commit to completing 30 story points. They complete like 5. Like it was just like embarrassingly low performance. And what I think the data would have led the organization to believe is that these people were ineffective, did not, or were lacking some skill set, or just didn't care and were doing the bare minimum. When in reality, I dare say that these were the hardest working people in the company. They had the worst tech stack. They had the most inefficient processes. They inherited all of the back-end systems that there was no documentation for. And so every single story was an absolute slog for them to get to. But there is no way that a number on a screen will tell you any of that information. There's no way. And so what I had to do, therefore, was throw myself on the sword and say, I just can't show this to you. Because until you understand that the only thing you can use this information for is to understand where there might be problems, and then to dig into what those problems are, then I can't help. I can't do this. Like, I will therefore bring you the problems of the data.
That's a beautiful way to, like, make sure that you're culturally changing how people see the metrics. And that is in line with, us having that really terrible forum where it was, why is this team bad? Or why are they not performing to their velocity? I remember one of my like personal performance goals was tied to my team's velocity. And I dug my heels in and said, no, I cannot guarantee you that my team is going to run at 80% of their velocity, 100%. That's not realistic. That's not okay. What if we all go on vacation? Then I don't meet my performance goal of getting my team there. And like, and I think it depends on, like, pick your battles, right? Choose your battles that you feel passionately about. But I felt super passionately about that one. And that was like an identifier of why this particular metric is seen in such a negative light. And it's seen in, like, velocity in general at a lot of organizations is seen in such a negative light because people from outside of the teams interpret it in such a manner that makes it become this thing that nobody wants to use, because it's used, again, back to the original, as a judgment tool, as something that is showing what teams are good and what teams are bad. And it's just simply not true. Yeah, it's almost like you have to take it a step further and really know that there's a bigger story. You almost have to, like, prep the audience for,
Well,
there's a bigger story here
I
than
know
just
that if I
this.
was listening to this podcast right now, I would be asking myself, okay, great. I get this, Jackie. I get it, Thomas. You can't do these things. People don't understand that. Like, but what do I do? Like, how do I start bringing people along the journey? So I will give you one, and it looks like Jackie's really excited. So I should think give you at least
You
one
go
thing.
first.
But
Yeah.
I put together this deck that we use on a monthly basis. We as a leadership team started looking at these metrics on a monthly basis. And because I understood that some people have varying levels of understanding of these metrics. So like some people were further along on the curve and they were like, yeah, I know that this is not for Pierce. I know these things, but some people didn't. And so what I did, in addition to just doing some of the more what I will call masking steps of converting things to percentage complete versus raw numbers and things like that. But in addition to all that, I made the slide, and for every metric, I had a pre slide. So I'd say like velocity, and then there was a pre slide, and the pre slide said velocity is a measure of blank. Velocity is calculated like this, and these are the things that you can do with this information. Like you can ask questions around like, why am I saying this trend? Because you are looking at a trend over time. You can ask questions about like specific blips. But I was like, you cannot use it for these things. Like, and the slide explicitly said, you can do this, you cannot do this. And I would sometimes even flip back to that slide when we got to the actual data slide that has information on it. People are like, well, why is this sitting so slow? I literally click back in the slide deck while I'm sharing screens and say, unfortunately, that is a question that we can't ask because this information has not told us anyone is slower or faster. There's no measure of fast speed in this. This is only a measure of how much work is actually completed in an interval. And we can ask what work was not completed and why wasn't it completed, but that's a different question than what you asked. It's like I forced people to use the right language, and it was still a flaw. It's like that's one of the things that you can do to start bringing people along. You can literally slap them on the list and be like, that's not right.
Right. That's a great, well, and it's a visual. I love a visual. It's a reminder every time. So there's repetition, and it's an immediate course correct when someone tries to go off the rails and creates that negative environment. And I like, I'm high-fiving you through the screen, about the definitions.
And I'm accepting it over here.
Yes. But seriously, about the definitions page, like, it's so important. One of the things that I really enjoyed about my previous role is that I got to work with several teams on pulling together like a metrics review for the larger organization. And one of those things was to just really brain dump, what are the metrics we even care about and why? Like, it's the why. What is it used for? And then we aligned on starting with, a smaller number of them to get going and because really it's an introduction to that entire population of the organization of, here's what we're going to start talking about. We're going to start with a couple at a time. We're going to get used to talking about these in a very positive way, in a very forward-thinking way, and not a blaming way, and not a judgment way. And it was super cool because the first rule of business or order of business was to put down what those metrics actually measure and pressure test it with that like smaller group. Do you understand what I'm saying when I say velocity is this? Do you understand what I'm saying when I'm saying, like XYZ time is this, or like whatever that is? And it was just such a cool thing. And so I second and high five that approach. I got really excited for an approach, but I don't remember what it was. I mostly was just like excited about, I'm like jazzed about the way that
about
we changed.
Metrics. You're just jazzed about metrics.
Just jazzed about metrics, like, because they can be so useful, and they were such a scary thing for so long for me. And now I just love them. gosh. Golly gee. I think you also have to
Well,
have someone that's
yeah.
like you gotta have someone that like wants to change the way that metrics are used too, right? Like you gotta have that momentum, which I think we kind of already touched on. Oh my gosh, have we talked about metrics for almost 50 minutes?
Yeah, I was about to. That's what I was coming in to say. Like, I'm nervous to bring up another topic because I don't know that we have the time to talk about this anymore. We didn't talk about like identifying a change champion and or metrics owner. Like, someone needs to be accountable for establishing metrics and like getting them like pressure tests to the point you were just making a moment ago. Like figuring out what tools you're going to use for visualization, because I think it's important to have the metrics available to the team so that they're not just like kept in a secret place and only talked about when you feel like talking about them. We have not talked
Mm-hmm.
about how do we introduce new metrics or graduate from metrics, because I think there are some metrics that you graduate from after a while. It's like, this is no longer serving us. It did serve us quite tremendously, but it just doesn't anymore. Like, we've past that, and like all these other things that we did not talk about, but I don't know that we have time today.
We do not have time today, but it sounds like, as along with many other podcasts, this could be a part 2 in the future. You ready for the recap?
Hit me with it.
Okay, this one is going to be really sporadic as these are crazy notes today. All right, so we talked today about metrics and measures, and really we kicked it off with how people feel about metrics and measures and identifying the fact that there is a lot of nervousness around this topic. And so how do we get through that nervousness? We talked about being brave, being a champion, and figuring out really why and the metrics are being used, and like trying to drive transparency into what the meaning is of those metrics. Make it real, make it a real thing for folks. If it's ambiguous and out there, it's not going to land. We then dove into talking about individual level metrics versus team metrics. And really, individual level metrics, that data should be private. That is not a company showcase. But team metrics, excellent for ensuring that you're sharing that is public. Teams know what they're doing, how they're doing, where they're going, and why. Metrics need to have therefore, like a therefore, this is important. And if it doesn't, and Thomas's examples encourages you to stop tracking them, that's just a waste of time then. You can always come back to it. We talked about the team happiness score, which is really a fist of 5 check-in. And the real big learning there was you could keep track of that and then use that to get insights into longer stream ideas and events that happen at the company and see if there's ways you could proactively manage your team and help your team and support your team. So I think that was a great people leadership moment in our podcast. We did skip over and started to talk a little bit about product metrics, mostly specifically success criteria, in that it's something so simple and it should be there. And if there's ever a question or doubt in anyone's mind, go back to that success criteria. It can help you with scope creep and being able to push back and ask why if somebody wants to add something into that big bucket of work. And it limits, the amount of things that you need to get done in terms of that product until the next version or what have you. There's also other product metrics as well, like feature usage or users that log in, that we should be always looking at, because that can in the long run identify whether or not we were successful in what we've been building. Then we bounced around some more and we talked a lot about metrics being as simple as possible, right? We don't want to create metrics that are so hard to understand that they're of use to no one, but having something simple and having something easily defined that we can continue to share. So as you roll out metrics and you're dealing with people outside of the team, we want to make sure we have the proper definitions in place, the proper visuals in place, and that we're able to repeat what these things are used for in the event that they start to go off track. I can no longer read my notes, so I believe that is the wrap up for now. Thomas, what am I missing?
That's all. That's everything. We can cover the next batch of stuff in the second part 2, but I think that well sums up. Metrics are hard. They're frustrating. They're confusing at times, but it's all about making sure that you yourself are passionate about the outcomes, understand how the metrics contribute to the outcome you're driving, and then your passion can be infectious to other people. Don't get frustrated when people misinterpret like that's going to happen. Just continue to be the person who politely redirects them back to the correct outcomes that they're supposed to be driving to. With that, my loves,
Perfect.
that's it. That's all. We're done
All right. See you
for
later,
now.
Transformers. Bye.
Bye.